It was a dark night in the desert of Basra when I first heard the name Malik al-Maut. I was at the souk, the great market filled with the scents of spices, incense, and the distant sound of musicians playing lutes, when the old merchant, with whom I had exchanged silver coins, whispered that name as if it were a curse. Malik al-Maut, the Lord of Secrets, the keeper of the doors no man should cross. I laughed, but the laughter didn't last long. He told me of a palace lost beyond the sands where a caliph, long before the time of Harun al-Rashid, once ruled. This caliph, Majid al-Rashid, was obsessed with power. Not the power of men or lands, but power over fate itself. It was said that he had bargained with the ancient gods, those who walked among mortals long before cities rose. Legend spoke of a falling star that landed in the desert and how Majid, in his madness, sent men to retrieve it. Oh, how they screamed upon their return. But none lived to tell what they saw. Driven by curiosity, I followed the trail of the story, ignoring the warnings the merchant gave me, and set out toward the ruins of that cursed palace. The legends, like a web of shadows, wove through the alleys of Baghdad, spoken by wise men and fools alike. Each tale was more sinister than the last, but I was young, bold, and my feet carried me across the desert, where the wind howled like lost souls. I arrived at the place as night fell. The ruins were immense, and the broken pillars looked like the bones of a giant, twisted by time's passage. There stood the gate. It was made of black stone, cold to the touch, even under the scorching heat of the day. Oh, how foolish I was to cross it. The night, usually a relief in the desert, felt suffocating, as if the very air was thick with dark secrets. My legs trembled, but I forced myself to go on. Inside it, I found vast halls filled with shadows that slithered like serpents. In the center of the great hall was a throne, and on that throne sat a figure, motionless, draped in a veil that looked like it was woven from cobwebs. The place reeked of something ancient, something alive. Every step I took toward that figure felt like walking into an abyss, but I went. When I lifted the veil, my heart nearly stopped. It was the Caliph himself, or what remained of him. His skin, wrinkled and gray, seemed like a dried mask stretched over bones. His eyes were open, but they were two empty pits, lifeless, and yet I knew he could see. I felt his presence as if time itself was trapped there with him. Then I heard a sound, not with my ears, but in my mind. You came seeking what you cannot carry. Oh, how I trembled. Suddenly the walls seemed closer, the ceilings lower, and I knew I was no longer alone. The shadows on the walls moved. I ran, the sound of footsteps that weren't mine echoing through the corridors as the callous voice whispered behind me, calling my name, promising things I never wanted to hear. I found an exit, or at least I thought it was an exit, and stepped outside, but the desert had changed. There were no more stars in the sky, only a black void that watched me, and then I saw him. The man cloaked in a mantle, his face hidden. Malik al-Maut. The name whispered like a cold breeze in my ears. He stood before me, motionless, but the silence around him was more threatening than any scream. When he raised his hand, the desert around me seemed to freeze in time, and I knew I was trapped there in that moment, in that place, just like all who came before me. But then something unexpected. The sound of footsteps behind me, not shadows, but something more familiar. I turned only to see my own silhouette watching me. I was there on the other side of the desert, walking toward myself with the same desperation I felt. But how? I was seeing myself lost, condemned. Tried to run, but the desert stretched endlessly as I watched my own figure draw closer, closer. The terror inside me grew. I was being hunted by myself, and the despair was so deep it felt like it was tearing my soul apart. Oh, how I wished I had never heard that name. How I wished I had never gone beyond the sands, where time and space unravel in ways the human mind cannot comprehend. But now Malik al-Maut was with me, his presence weighed in the air like an invisible, suffocating cloak. Every breath felt harder, every step heavier, as if I was being swallowed by the desert itself. I wanted to run, to escape that place, and my own shadow closing in on me, but my legs no longer obeyed. The desert stretched endlessly, and no matter where I turned, the horizon remained the same. Empty, stagnant, an endless echo of sand and darkness. Then I realized with growing horror that I wasn't running in circles. I wasn't running at all. I was stuck, frozen in time, while the other me drew closer, faster now, with eyes that gleamed in a way mine never had. Malik al-Maut, the silent and motionless figure, raised his arm toward me, and the truth hit me with the force of 1,000 storms. I was being replaced. That me approaching wasn't a mirage, wasn't an illusion. He was my successor, the version of me that would carry my fate. the fate I never should have dared to challenge. He advanced. I felt life, or what was left of it, slip away from me like sand through fingers. My body, once solid, began to disintegrate piece by piece as if being undone in the very desert that surrounded me. I did not scream. There was no air for that. There was no sound, except for my own breath growing weaker, more distant. When the other me finally reached me, his eyes locked with mine for a moment, and I understood. He was now me, and I was just a shadow, destined to be forgotten in the sands of time. Malik al-Maut lowered his arm slowly, and everything went silent. The desert, once pulsing with mystery and danger, now stood still, stagnant. There was no more wind, no more time. Was no longer there. And then the sound, that metallic, ancient sound, echoed in the distance. It was the sound of a door closing. Not a physical door, but something deeper and more final. The cycle was complete. The one who enters shall never leave. Now there is nothing but silence. No desert, no fate. Only the void.
Samarkand, 1403, a city where the desert winds whispered ancient secrets and the turquoise domes of its mosques shimmered under the harsh sun. I had heard of its fabled wealth, its knowledge that stretched from Persia to China, and its unrivaled marketplaces. But I hadn't come for gold or silk. No, what drew me here was far darker, a relic said to be cursed, hidden away in the labyrinthine corridors of the pearl market. It was the early morning, the market already buzzing with life. The streets smelled of spices and leather, and the merchants' cries filled the air. My contact had warned me. Find the Kalandar gate, the one none dare enter. Beyond that lies your path. I found the gate tucked away, half buried in sand and forgotten by most. It was old, its once intricate carvings now worn by time, but still intimidating. No one came near. My gut twisted, but I had already come too far. Stepping through, it felt as if the world behind me faded into silence, replaced by a hollow wind that tasted of iron. The market on the other side was unlike the bustling world I had just left. Here, it was deathly quiet. Rows of dilapidated stalls, draped in torn silks, stood abandoned. The air felt wrong, thick, suffocating, yet I pressed on. I passed by stalls of forgotten trinkets, jeweled daggers, and ancient manuscripts, but none of them interested me. My eyes sought something more, sinister. Then, at the farthest end of the street, I saw it. A small, unremarkable tent, its entrance flanked by two ivory statues of lions. They stared, lifeless and cold. The Pearl of Khatun, the object I sought, was said to be housed within. The moment I stepped inside, I felt the temperature drop. A figure sat at the back, hooded, his face obscured by shadow. "You seek the pearl," he rasped, his voice a blend of gravel and whispers. He extended a skeletal hand toward a chest, its surface blackened and charred. My heart raced as I reached out, but something held me back. A memory, a warning, crept into my mind. I had heard stories of Timur the Lame, the ruthless conqueror who had once sought the same pearl. He had ravaged the lands, carving his way through Persia, sacking cities, leaving only ash in his wake. Yet upon reaching Samarkand, he had returned empty-handed. Some said it was the pearl that cursed him, turning his victory into dust. I hesitated, but curiosity, foolish and irresistible, drove me. I opened the chest. Inside, it lay on a bed of red silk, glowing faintly like the moon. As I touched it, the tent around me seemed to dissolve, replaced by a vast, empty desert. I stood alone under a blood-red sky, and the wind howled. I blinked, and suddenly I was not alone. Figures emerged from the sands, warriors, merchants, mothers, children. Their eyes were hollow, their faces twisted in agony. They did not speak, but I could feel their pain, their suffering, pouring into me. "Timur's army," I whispered as it dawned on me. They had been here, just like I was now. These were not mere phantoms. They were remnants, souls bound to this cursed land, drawn to the pearl like moths to flame. I turned to run, but the desert stretched on endlessly. My breath came in ragged gasps. Then I saw her, a woman cloaked in black, her eyes glowing a deep, haunting violet. The Khatun. You seek what was never yours to claim, her voice echoed in my head, though her lips never moved. I fell to my knees, the weight of her presence unbearable. My mind screamed for release, but my body was paralyzed. She stepped closer, her hands reaching out, her cold fingers brushing my skin. Wait, please. I choked out, but my voice was swallowed by the desert. Just as I thought the darkness would consume me entirely, I found myself back in the tent, the pearl still in my hand. The hooded figure was gone, the market outside silent. But something had changed. I could feel it. Something was with me now, watching, waiting. I left the pearl market in a daze, not fully understanding what had happened, but knowing I had unleashed something far worse than any curse I had imagined. Days passed. I thought perhaps it was over, that the pearl's curse had left me untouched. But then the dreams began. Visions of Timur soldiers, their bodies withering under the desert sun, their cries echoing in my mind. Each night they grew stronger, more vivid. And then, in broad daylight, as I walked through Samarkand's bustling streets, I saw them again. Those hollow-eyed figures. They stood among the living, unnoticed by everyone but me. Their eyes followed my every move, unblinking, accusing. Could feel their hatred, their sorrow, crushing me from all sides. I tried to run, but no matter where I went, through the parks, the bazaars, even the palaces, they were there, always watching. I had become marked. There was no escaping them. One evening, as I sought refuge in the Bibi Kenan Mosque, hoping the sacred air might offer protection, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. Turning, I saw her again, the Khatun, her eyes burning brighter than ever. You are bound now, she whispered. You carry their pain, their fate. Before I could respond, the air around me thickened. The walls of the mosque seemed to close in, and the haunting silence returned. There was no escape. The curse had already sunk its claws into my soul, dragging me deeper into a void from which no light could reach. And as I write this now, I know this is only the beginning.
I remember the first time I stepped foot in Kyoto. It was 1897, a time of great transformation in Japan. The Meiji Restoration had swept through the nation, bringing with it railroads, telegraphs, and the winds of modernization. But even amidst all that change, Kyoto seemed untouched, as if the ancient city had a mind of its own, resisting the flow of time. My reasons for being there were personal. I'd heard whispers of an ancient temple tucked away in the forested hills just outside the city, a place where history and myth intertwined. They called it Jigoku no Sido, the Temple of Hell. It wasn't a name many dared to utter in daylight, but the rumors were insistent about a cursed artifact hidden deep within its walls, an object said to bring both fortune and madness. And well, I was always drawn to the dangerous unknown. Kyoto's streets were bustling that day, filled with the clamor of merchants in the Nishiki market, selling everything from vibrant silk to dried fish. The scent of yakitori hum in the air, mingling with the sharp, fresh chill of autumn. But even as I walked through the city, I could feel something watching me. I shook it off as nerves. After all, who wouldn't be nervous knowing the destination? I had planned the journey carefully. The temple lay hidden beyond the philosopher's path, far from the eyes of the casual traveler. Locals avoided the area, too many stories, too much fear. Even the cherry blossoms, so beautiful and vibrant elsewhere in Kyoto, seemed to wither in that part of town. Still, I went. The path led me into a forest, the trees towering above, their branches clawing at the sky like ancient fingers. As I approached the temple, my heart began to pound, though not from exertion. No, this was something else, something primal. The structure itself was ancient, its wood darkened with age, moss creeping up its walls like an infection. There were no sounds of birds, no rustling of leaves, just silence. Inside, it was colder, though no wind touched me. My breath fogged in the dim light. The room was vast and empty, save for a single figure seated in the center. An old monk, his face wrinkled like crumpled parchment, eyes closed as if in deep meditation. He spoke without looking at me. "You come seeking what should not be sought." I froze. I hadn't told anyone about my intentions, yet here was this man, speaking my thoughts aloud. "You should leave," he continued, his voice low and grave, "before the Kamikakushi claim you." The Kamikakushi. I'd heard the term before in old stories about people who vanished without a trace, spirited away by unseen forces. But they were just that, stories. I told myself they couldn't be real. Yet, the tension in the air told a different tale. Ignoring his warning, I moved further into the temple, down a series of narrow, twisting corridors that seemed to stretch on forever. The walls were adorned with faded murals of creatures I couldn't quite recognize, twisted forms, almost human, yet distorted beyond recognition. Finally, I found it, an old chest, locked and sealed with an ancient script I didn't recognize. My pulse quickened as I pried it open. Inside was a small, jade statue of a figure I didn't recognize. It wasn't Buddha, not any deity I'd ever seen. The eyes of the statue seemed to follow me, filled with something like hunger. As I touched it, a coldness spread through my fingers, crawling up my arm like ice. Suddenly, the temple shifted. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, and the once still walls began to pulsate, as if alive. The whispers began. They weren't loud, but they were clear, in a language I didn't understand but could somehow feel deep in my bones. I tried to move to leave, but the corridors that had once been familiar twisted into something unrecognizable. The way out was gone. The monk's words echoed in my head. Kamigakushi. Panic welled up inside me. I ran, but no matter which way I turned, the halls stretched endlessly, the murals shifting, growing more grotesque, more real. Faces began to emerge from the walls, faces twisted in agony, eyes wide with terror, mouths open in silent screams. Then I saw him. At the end of the corridor stood a figure, draped in shadows, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He didn't move, but I could feel his gaze, cold and unyielding. My breath hitched as I realized he wasn't standing on the ground. He hovered, his feet inches above the floor, untouched by the physical world. I turned to run again, but this time the walls themselves seemed to close in, the faces pressing out, reaching for me with hands that shouldn't have existed. In my terror, I stumbled into the main hall, where the monk sat, still unmoving. But something was different. His eyes, once closed, were now open, and his mouth was stretched into a grotesque grin. "You cannot leave," he whispered, his voice no longer his own. "The jade claims you now." I looked down at my hand, where the statue had once been. It was gone, but the cold remained. I felt it then. A tug, not physical, but something deeper. I was being pulled, drawn into the temple, into something I couldn't comprehend. The air grew heavier, the shadows darker. The figure in the hall moved closer, his steps silent, his form indistinct but undeniable. I turned back to the monk, but he was no longer there. Only a pile of robes, crumpled and empty. And then, darkness. I don't know how long I've been here. Time has no meaning in this place, but I can feel it now, the jade, the whispers, the weight of the curse. The figure watches, always watching, waiting for me to move, to run, to resist. But I know better now. There is no escape.